What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking some updates that we got recently about Spiral from the Book of Saul, as well as some of my thoughts about whether or not the movie is going to be delayed again, and when are we ever going to see this movie. So before we get into all of my thoughts and speculations and just general opinions about what was said, we have to talk about specifically what was said. So Darren Lynn Bousman was interviewed about the upcoming movie, and when asked about Chris Rock's involvement, he said, Chris came in with a thriller concept. He pitched this very elaborate, dense idea. We wanted it to feel much more like Seven, but it has so many ties to the mythos of Saul. So really just jumping off of that, I don't really quite understand what they're talking about here. I mean, the original Saul was kind of in the vein of David Fincher's Seven. It's kind of hard to look at that original film and not think of Seven, especially given the time period in which it first came out. Now, I guess they can be saying that this movie in particular is going back to basics and it's going to be a much more tightly woven, character-driven story, and that kind of goes into what he said next about the gore factor in the film. He says, and I quote, "Gore and violence was the gimmick, I think. Gore and violence is no longer a gimmick. It just serves the story. This is much more about character, tension, and fear." And for one, I have to say that's the one reason I'm looking forward to this movie. I feel like there would be no reason to actually create it and put as much time, money, and effort into it and get the stars that they have in it to back the film if there wasn't a solid character narrative that was driving the film forward. Whether that character focus is ultimately going to fall to Chris Rock, Samuel L. Jackson, or some other character that we're not entirely introduced to yet, for me it's kind of interesting to sit around and talk about a Saul film that's much more character driven than it is the general story or even just the gore factor that was pushing pretty much every single film after the second one. Maybe even the second one too if you wanted to go that far. So yeah, I do kind of understand where they're coming from with this. You want a character-focused narrative that doesn't require the incredible knowledge that you need to have from the previous 8 films to understand exactly what's going on. And if you watch my channel enough, you know that I really love the Walking Dead franchise. One of the things that Scott M. Gimple has been talking about religiously as he's been making the Rick Grimes movies, how do you craft a story that takes a character that's established from 9 seasons of one of the most popular television shows in the last decade and give it a new spin where people who either gave up on the television show or have never seen it before are interested enough in watching that specific movie. And maybe if you do a good enough job, you can incite enough people who have never seen anything in that property before to go back and watch the previous entries in that entire series and get the full story for themselves. And in that sense, I feel like there is a lot to be said about doing something completely different within the Saul universe. Allowing the story, the characters, and just the legacy as a whole to branch out into different paths and tell different stories, while at the same time staying true to the original films and just building off of the mythology. I feel like Spiral has at least a decent chance of capturing the imagination of new horror fans and giving them a reason to go back and watch the original 8 films and get acquainted with the entire universe that all of us love so much. Now, whether or not that ends up occurring, I don't know. It depends on how good the entire film is, and as of right now, I have not seen it. And I guess that does lead me to my next point, something that I'll probably make a video about on its own, maybe in a couple of days or weeks from now, when we get a better sense of what's going to happen this May. But is it possible that Spiral is going to be delayed again? Given the fact that so many films have now been delayed for further along in the year of 2021, or maybe even just into 2022 altogether. And even now, the MCU, pretty much the most bulletproof item that any movie studio can put out, has decided that maybe May as a release date for Black Widow isn't the best option, and they're going to move it back again. They might even put it on Disney Plus. Who really knows at this point? And for me, I'm just looking at this thinking, if Black Widow can't bring in enough money, then what chance does Spiral have? I mean, unless it just sticks its ground, everything goes completely great from here on out and nothing happens, and literally it's the last man standing to kick off the summer movie blockbuster season, and people are just so excited to get back to the theaters and have fun that they flock to this movie in droves and it ends up making $150 million in its domestic box office and then more overseas and becomes the biggest hit in the franchise. That's kind of wishful thinking, honestly. And yeah, I don't think it's going to happen. And that also brings up the question is, if you move it, where do you move it to? I mean, if everything does get back together by October, then October is going to be very crowded. And despite whatever quality this movie might have, it's going to need a little bit of room to breathe as counter-programming or something of the sort. And obviously, you're not going to get that in October, given the fact that you have Halloween Kills and a lot of other high-profile horror movies potentially coming out during that time. So that really only leaves two other options for any real future release, being January of 2022, which, as I've argued on this channel multiple times, is a pretty good release date for horror movies, but it's not exactly what you want to put all your bets on. You know, given the fact if nothing heals up before January of 2022, maybe then people flock and we get the same scenario that I was talking about with everything sticking in May, but that is a huge long shot. And then at the same time, maybe you can just move it back to May of 2022. But my God, you have to imagine that Lionsgate and everybody who invested in this movie is going to start really wanting to see a return on that investment. And so that kind of leads me into my thought that maybe at some point they start thinking about selling it to somebody. I mean, I know it's not something they want to do. It's probably not something they would ever think about doing in any other context. But I mean, these are weird times. And honestly, making a quick buck on something when you're pretty much bleeding money is a good investment decision right now. And this movie looks pretty good. I feel like they could at least make a deal with Netflix or some other entity to get their money back. And wherever this movie lands, I'm sure that myself and anybody else listening to this right now would make the investment to make sure you have that subscription service so you can watch it. I don't know, guys. I'm going to think about it a little bit more, and then I'm going to come at y'all with some facts, figures, and just general discussion topics about whether or not they're going to sell this movie, but we're going to have to wait and see if they actually delay it first. If I was a betting man, then I would say in the next couple weeks, we're going to be getting the news that Spiral is not going to make its May 2021 release date, and they're going to push it back to probably October. But, no bets right now. Anyway, guys, what are your thoughts on all of this? Spiral as a movie, do you think it's going to sell to people? Do you like the idea that it's a character-driven narrative that's kind of going back to basics? Do you think that Spiral is going to make its release date? And if it doesn't, where do you think it's going to end up? Or is it just going to go directly to streaming at some point? Tell me in the comment section below. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day, staying safe and healthy. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell over by the subscriber button to notify you every single time I upload. It's been real.